Looks like we are live. A special edition Coffee with Rich on a Thursday morning. And today I'm joined by my good friend, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Brothers. Can I still say that? Or you're not quite retired yet, are you?
Not quite retired. You can say it a little bit longer.
Okay.
I won't answer to it, though.
Well, my good friend Dave Brothers. We're in the Marine Corps together. Those of you that don't know me, my name is Rich Brown, co-host and co-founder of the American Warrior Society and the American Warrior Show, America's #1 self-defense podcast. And it looks like we got one person jumping on, 4 people on so far. If you're just jumping on, I know I did not have this in the event, so you didn't know this was coming. So you're welcome for the surprise. That's right. I'm joined by my good friend Dave Brothers. Looks like Will is on. Says, good morning, Rich and Dave from Missouri. If you're just jumping on, let me know where you're coming from. If you're a coin member of the American Warrior Society, I'd love to know your coin number and where you're at. Today, we're just going to kind of briefly introduce Dave and let you know some of the things he's going to be doing for us, as well as a little bit about his background, and really looking forward to today's show. Dave, without further ado, brother, let's read your bio. And I have it here somewhere. Here we go. Lieutenant Colonel David R. Brothers, United States Marine Corps, was commissioned as a second lieutenant in September of 1999. After completing the basic school and logistics officers course in late 2000, he reported to 1st Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment in Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii. After Hawaii, 1st Lieutenant Brothers was selected for recruiting duty and served as the executive officer of Recruiting Station Louisville. And that's where Dave and I met when I was the operations officer there. Dave was my XO. After recruiting duty, Dave entered the Marine Corps Reserves, starting with the Marine Corps for Life program, which quickly led to a billet as the regional OIC for the Wounded Warrior Regiment in support of the Eastern Seaboard. Major Brothers was assigned to the General Staff of Marine Forces Reserve in New Orleans, Louisiana, starting in 2009, and was assigned as the Military Construction Plans Officer through 2011, at which time he entered Resident Command and Staff at the Air War College in Montgomery, Alabama. Following graduation in 2012, Major Brothers was assigned as the China Plans Officer, G5 Division, Marine Forces Pacific in Camp Smith, Hawaii. After 2 years in that position, Major Brothers was promoted to the position of Plans Chief, overseeing the development of all strategic planning efforts for the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater. Lieutenant Colonel Brothers received orders to Force Headquarters Group, Marine Forces Reserves, New Orleans, Louisiana, in 2015, where he was assigned as the Force Level Logistics Officer. He remained in this position until 2018, when he was selected to attend top-level school at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Following graduation from the War College, Lieutenant Colonel Brothers was assigned as the Executive Officer for Deployment Processing Command West aboard Area 64 on Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. This is the command that Lieutenant Colonel Brothers is currently retiring from. Lieutenant Colonel Brothers has a bachelor's from Florida State Universities and an MA from the Air War College and an MBA from George Ford College of Business, WKU, and a master's from the Naval War College and an MS from the Whitman School of Management, Syracuse University. Very accomplished. He has been married to his wife, Denise Brothers, for 21 years, and they have 2 amazing children, Owen and Izzy. Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel Brothers, and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Rich, and I'm really, really pleased to be here.
And we're happy to have you. Let's see. David Garrett is on. Says, good morning from South Carolina, coin number 1896. If you want to know what a coin number is, you're going to have to check out the American Warrior Society and find out if becoming a coin member is the right thing for you. We have everything for your self-defense needs inside the training vault. Jesse Perez is on. Good morning, Jesse, from Grand Rapids, Michigan, coin number 2221. My good friend, Dr. Fuller, is on. South Carolina, coin number 1620. Jay out there in Hawaii. Good morning, Jay. Hope you're doing well, sir. Says, good morning from Hawaii. Gents, coin number 188. Please like and hit that share button. I'm just going to kind of pick Dave's brain and tell Dave ask him really what his plans are for the American Warrior Society. What are you going to help us with, Dave?
As a member, and just to be clear, I've been a member for over a year now. I would like to get the message out to everybody, at least that's out there, that you may not have access to the best training areas or the most comprehensive or up-to-date equipment. But now that you have platforms like this, and especially AWS, you really don't have any excuse not to access the most up-to-date doctrine regarding personal defense. Just like you can take a Harvard course online right now through a number of different platforms, you can also take the Harvard of handgun, edge weapons, long rifle, you name it. And there's really just no excuse not to be as sharp as you possibly can on your own individual practice.
Yeah, well said. And I don't know, you were just here at the farm. I didn't tell you, I just completed a Harvard online course and working on I'm enrolled in another Harvard graduate program. So I think that continuing education is incredibly important. And with the things that are going on in the world today, learning a little bit of self-defense, probably not a bad idea.
Not at all. I don't think you can watch the news, regardless of what your political stripe is, without having a strong sense of how your personal sovereignty and carrying an individual weapon applies to the modern world.
You know, one of the first questions I want to ask you, Dave, and something that's been really troubling me with what's going on in the world, and I get a lot of phone calls about it, and I'm just not sure. Is my car approaching the end of its warranty period? I keep getting all these phone calls. It seems to be something I should be worried about. Do you have any idea about that?
I have no idea about that. Not at all.
Hey, man, I wanted to ask you, Dave, what does your bio overlook, man? That's a very, very impressive bio, but what does it overlook about you?
Okay, so if I'm talking to the AWS audience, I'd like to be very clear, and it's important because you'll be hearing from me later. And I'm not an operator. I've been in the Marine Corps for 23 years, and my job is not to locate, close with, and destroy the enemy individually. My job was to do that at core level, MEF level, and higher. So I'm kind of what the running joke is, the guy who's got his staff ass glued to a staff chair and a staff desk and responding to the general when he wants something. Having said that, 23 years in the Marine Corps has exposed me to operators ranging from ODA team leaders through SEAL teams, through SAS teams that I worked with in Hawaii. And they all share the same quality, and the same quality in my experience has been, they don't talk about it because it's something they did 6, 10, 15 months ago. They talk about it because that training is ongoing, and they probably spent a couple hours at the range today, or a couple hours in the weight room, or a couple hours on the mat. If they're operating, it's because they're sharp now. It's not that they were sharp when they were young. And that made me really excited to join AWS because, you know, even as I get older and the further away I get from the Marine Corps, I don't want to necessarily lose the stuff that I've worked to acquire. And in fact, I'd like to make it better. Yeah,
That's a great point. And I hear this a lot from guys that are my age. And of course, I'm in my 50s. And that is that, well, you know, back in the day, I could do this, and this, that. I don't care. I'm not impressed about that. What can you do today? If performance on demand was required of you, what are you capable of doing? And of course, it's not going to be what you could do back then. I get it. We all got bad backs and bad knees, especially former action guys. I totally get that. But you need to do what you can do within your limitations. Would you agree with that, Dave?
I would absolutely agree with that. And you may not be at the high order of an 18-year-old Olympic athlete going through buds right now, which nobody, 0.0001% of the population is. However, if you're stacking yourself up against what you would be if you weren't training, there needs to be a significant difference between the trained you and the untrained you.
Yeah, totally well said. You know, one of the things you and I talked about the other day was my week spent in the hospital with a cardiac issue. And, the next year I did the beast up Black Mountain, 16 miles of hell. And I think that, I spent 6 months training for it. It wasn't something that I just went out there and did on a Saturday. I really prepared myself for it as much as I could and whooped it on, because I believe that as a part of the leadership of AWS, we have to be leading from the front. I'll be on the mats tonight. I'll be on the range today. And I don't give a crap what I could do in the 90s. It's irrelevant to today. And it looks like we got some folks joining us. My brother, Jeff Brown, retired maritime law enforcement officer from the Coast Guard. Good morning, Jeff. Guile is on from the Philippines. Hey, Guile, good morning. Hope you're safe, sir. My good friend Manhar out there in South Africa. Brother, I hope you're staying safe. And I want to use Manhar as an example, Dave, if I could, to say, we never know when that moment's going to come. Manhar, a very educated, very intelligent business owner in South Africa that found himself in the middle of an apocalypse, basically, and him and his community rallied and performed incredibly well. So my hat's off to you, sir, but you're an example for what possible looks like. Dave Frazier's on, says, hey, Rich. My good friend Steve Washington's on, says, good morning, Rich and David. Cedar Springs, Michigan, coin number 2003. TC Fuller says, but Rich, I was really, really cool in the 90s. Brother, TC, you're real cool right now, man. I don't know what you're talking about. Mark Few is on, says, good morning, Rich. Mark, I owe you some stuff. I'm going to send you an email today, Mark. So thank you to the 14 folks joining us live. I got a few questions for you, man. Why did you end up joining the Marine Corps, Dave?
I joined the Marine Corps because my dad was an artillery officer during Vietnam, and his dad was an infantry NCO with the Marine Corps during the Battle of Okinawa. So growing up without necessarily knowing it, I was steeped in the culture and the ethos of the Marine Corps for my entire life. I got my father's sword when I was 5 years old. I still have it today. My grandfather talked to me about what it was like to walk out of one of the worst battles of World War II, and then go fishing with the potato mashers he found in a cave in Okinawa. So when it came time for me to grow up and get out of college and move on with my life, there was never a question about whether I was going to spend a lot of time in the Marine Corps. I was always going to be a Marine officer. What surprises me is that now, 23 years later, I'm still a Marine officer, and I kept going after that initial tour, which I think surprises every Marine that retires. I'm sure you felt the same way. You blink and suddenly everybody you worked with is old, and you're leaving for the last time.
Yeah, it's a surreal experience, isn't it? But that's the thing, man. We all got to hang it up at some point. A lot of my friends struggle with this, and they deal with depression and anxiety when it's the time comes to hang your cleats up, because we all come to that point at some point. But knowing when it's time to let the young guys take the mantle and run with the flag, man, it's a tough decision.
Yes.
Dave Frazier says, going to BJJ right now. Dave, take it easy on those guys, and I hope you get promoted real soon, brother. It's unacceptable that you haven't been promoted yet. That's just my opinion. Hey, what does being an officer mean to you, aside from just being a Marine? For those of you that are joining us this morning, there's enlisted and officers, and it's not necessarily a senior and subordinate relationship. It's more like a teacher relationship. But what is being an officer? What has it meant to you?
The science of being an officer is very simple. And, you're going to be familiar with what I'm about to say, because I think it came from your mouth when I was a very young first lieutenant. The officer corps basically has to do two things. It has to make decisions, and then it has to take responsibility for those decisions. There is no situation I have encountered in 20 plus years that falls outside of those two wickets. The science of being an officer, I think, is built on self-awareness. And that self-awareness is a clear-eyed view of what you are good at and what you are not good at. And once you realize that you are not a super action hero and that you are a fallible human being, you can begin to surround yourself with talent that mitigates your weakness and provides you with insight as to what the best way forward is. And once I came to that realization, I also found that I was never without talent to answer the need. And it very seldom came from my own brain, because anybody who leads Marines, officer, enlisted, very quickly realizes that most of your subordinates, at least in some fashion, are far more intelligent than you are.
And if not far more intelligent, certainly far more experienced.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that, this today's show is just to introduce Dave to the community and let you guys know what he's going to be doing for us, doing a little bit of future ops, a little bit of business development for the next several months. So we're very fortunate to have him. And if you're just joining me, my name is Rich Brown, co-host, co-founder of the American Warrior Society, the American Warrior Show, retired Marine Corps officer myself, former police officer, corrections officer, and special operations officer. And we're here with Lieutenant Colonel Dave Brothers. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Dave, because you were the China plans officer there for, I believe, the Pacific. What what is the greatest threat to the English speaking world? And I don't mean to primp it with China. It could be something else.
I think the greatest threat to the English speaking world, and possibly the United States being a microcosm of that, is shame and ingratitude. And I will say that the ingratitude of not realizing what it has taken to get us to where we are now, and the shame in that the things that we enjoy right now and what I will call the Western world, which is sort of an overlay to the English speaking one, are things that were acquired largely through divinity or luck, whatever your metaphysics are, but that have been retained due to the blood, sacrifice, and austere decisions made by not hundreds, but thousands of years of human beings executing better judgment than we have. And anyone who lives in the Western world and doesn't realize that we perch precariously on the shoulders of giants, I think fails to understand what we represent in the modern world. It is that view alone that I think is the greatest shame. The geopolitics will always be there because above the state, it's a Hobbesian,
Leviathan.
world of strong win and the weak do what they must, right?
That's right.
But we're in a very rare period where that Hobbesian existence does not extend to your wife and kids or my wife and kids. And I think we need to remember that every single day.
Yeah, I'm going to unpack a little bit of that because I love that. I think that's a really unique perspective, and one I haven't heard, because I do tend to ask some version of that question to all my guests. Johnny King says, "Good day, gentlemen, from the Bluegrass Army Depot. Memphis Beach is on. Good morning, sir, my fellow Tennessean and brother Marine." He says, "Good morning, gents. Memphis, Tennessee, 1751 is his coin number. Semper Fi." Dr. Fuller says, "Troops are cunning and bear watching, and the things they come up with are hysterical." Yeah, and Dr. Fuller was an EOD officer in the Army before going to the FBI. Gordon Botson is on. Good morning, sir. It says coin number 1688 up there in Ohio. Please like and hit that share, but just a few things. So I want to unpack. So the ingratitude is what you said is the greatest threat to the Western world. And it reminds me, there's a scene from the TV show Outlander, and I may even put it up on the closed group today because I want people to see it. And there's this Scotsman that came over from Scotland, and he's sitting there with his wife, and they're looking across the Appalachian Mountains into what is today Tennessee. And she's kind of, because she's from the future, and she's talking to this guy, Jamie, who's not from the future. He's from the 1700s. And she's explaining to him what is to come. And she's like, there's our families are going to go out across here generations. We're going to build this country into a great nation. And but it's perched precariously on this fragile thing called personal liberties and freedoms. Dave, can you, what is it? What is it that's gonna topple us, man? It's not a foreign foe potentially? It's just ingratitude.
Well, I'm not a historian, although I've had 2 years of what I'll call the history and political science behind military operations. But all I will say is large events tend to take place in the fertile ground of the population in which they occur. And if that population is ripe for the divestiture and disownership of their own heritage, then it's not a very difficult reality for one domino to lead to the toppling of nations. I mean, nations are rise and fall all the time. And certainly less advanced nations than the United States, where citizenship it requires a great deal of ownership of what it means to be a citizen of the United States. Even here, where it is very complex and very difficult, it is also very easy, especially within an internet-driven age of global sectarianism, for the whole thing to just collapse. And that's not even correcting for the fact that, like Moore's law of information, you could also apply that same dynamic to lethality. Lethality expands every single day, and the ability to impact targets with global geometries is more and more rapidly getting pushed into the hands of non-Westphalian nation states who are driven by ideology that you and I can comprehend but can't quite understand, if that nuance makes sense. So I don't think it's going to be easier to defend the United States. I think it's going to be far more difficult. And I think a lot of that defense, quite frankly, Rich, is going to start occurring at home when it used to occur abroad.
Yeah. What makes you say that? Is that just an educated guess, or do you have something to that?
In any sense, that's going to be an educated guess. I think when we were at the War College, we had a lot of discussions about homeland security and homeland defense. And if you're in the military industrial complex or the homeland security complex, the biggest thing to understand is that is the huge distinction of the 21st century, because, and especially for guys like you, and I think a lot of guys listening on this, homeland defense is what happens when you go to OIF or OEF or sub-Saharan Africa or any of the other hotspots in the world, and you engage an adversary that exists on ground that you can selectively enter and exit as you choose. But it's still thousands of miles away. Homeland security is the same occurrence with an equally complex and lethal adversary that might occur 10 miles from where your wife and children are sleeping. And the emotional difference between the two of those things is an immense gulf. And I think you certainly, and a lot of the listeners here, understand that difference when they look at how, certain entities in OIF engage the defense of their own homeland, in some cases with nothing more than baseball bats and crude explosives built out of car batteries, right? We have lost the ability to retain a global defense posture that meaningfully prevents adversaries with increased lethality from entering our home space. And I genuinely believe that it's going to become more and more important for every single, at least male, not to be sexist, but every single adult male to be capable of a reasonable level of physical fitness and the ability to cycle a weapon system in a meaningful way in defense of their own home.
No, I don't disagree with that at all. And you and I were talking about, and we certainly won't go into it here. I don't think it would be reasonable or responsible, but some of the high level planning that you've been in regards to some of the homeland issues and some of the things certainly that I was exposed to through FEMA and the Red Cross. And when you hear what the high level planning is, you go, holy cow, we really are going to be on our own, just like Manhar and his fellow South African citizens that were armed, like you said, Dave, with cricket bats and golf clubs to beat back a horde trying to burn and destroy everything in their path. And your point too about these ideological sectarian, not even nation states, but just ideologues that don't see the world the way you and I see it. And their view of paradise on earth has nothing to do with what you and I and our families would consider that.
I was rudely introduced to that. One of my mates at the Naval War College, and I won't give his name, but he had just finished 2 straight decades of engaging the Tamil Tigers, which were still somewhat of a threat. And he explained to me that once he returned, he was going to go out to sea to keep engaging them, while at the same time he knew that their greatest AOR actually happened to be where his wife and children were living while he was going to sea. So I think we're going to have to lean on our brothers in places like that more and more to teach us the lessons of what it is like to engage an enemy that isn't a world away.
And I think, man, because conflict is the norm in so much of the world, and we in America have just gotten so used to grabbing our Starbucks on our iPhone and getting in our conditioned SUV and paying for cheap gas and going where we want. And I just don't know that if the bulk of Americans, and I pray I'm wrong, but are ready for that, because they haven't created and maintained an appropriate level of physical fitness. They don't know the working end of a firearm, and they probably couldn't throw a punch if their life depends on it. So, again, like Johnny King says here, and I tell you what, this is an incredible way of saying it, Johnny. He says, we better figure it out quick because we have worn out the coattails of our forefathers.
Well said.
Yeah, well said. Guile says, totally agree. We should be always ready, capable to defend and fight, adapt to a lot of situations. Yeah, and especially in a place like Philippines where Guile is at, I've been there when it was pretty tumultuous in the Philippines, and And it can be that way again there at any time. And it may come here in America as well. Dave, I want to ask you another question, man. With the rise of mass shootings, and I keep hearing this word gun violence, and it's one that I really don't like because we don't say rented truck violence. We don't say, plutonium
violence. Yeah.
We don't say plutonium violence when somebody drops a bomb on a city. I don't know why we say gun violence, but anyway, that's we can have that philosophical conversation some other time. But is gun control the answer? And if not, what is?
I'm going to give you my very layman's view, and again, I'm not an academic or a professional politician. I will say my understanding of the Bill of Rights is not so much that it is a bunch of things that our predecessors voted on to say we will retain. My understanding of the Bill of Rights is that it is a set of rights that may not be infringed upon by another human being. Even if you assume, and I'm not making the case, even if you assume there is some mechanism of administrative control through legal channels or supply channels or otherwise that make it feasible to control the lethality carried by an individual American, that does not give the state the right to do so. It is regrettable that gun violence exists in any capacity, and I think we would all love a utopian world where violence is not a necessary adjunct to the state's ability to retain control of a geography. However, having said that, history has repeatedly shown on both sides of whatever political coin you have that power comes out of the barrel of a gun. And said another way, that the right to bear arms, which is a sense saying the right to carry and operate lethal tools, establishes individual sovereignty within any type of state. And as a father and as a husband, there will never be a day within my choice where I am unable to defend my own home and family from whatever may occur. And that is irrelevant to me what political state we are in. If it needs to be legal or illegal to do so, I will do so.
Yeah, well said, man. And, it's interesting. We could talk about the 10th Amendment because I think it's pretty interesting how we don't really talk about that much. But the 10th Amendment, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the state, should be reserved to the state to make decisions on. And we talked about that a little bit while you were here, the balkanization or potential balkanization of our country because of the powers granted by the 10th Amendment. But I think that could be bad for us as a giant republic, but it could be really good as we see certain states that are taking decisions that maybe aren't good for everyone. And one of the ones that obviously is becoming a flashpoint is the potential gun control issues. And when I had these conversations about, gun violence, I think it's either the third or the fourth leading cause of death is malpractice. And yet we don't say doctor and nurse violence. But if you're killing your patient and the first rule is do no harm, then I got to say, what are we doing? Because the Constitution does not say your right to health care should not be infringed. It says the right to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. But yet healthcare kills hundreds of thousands of Americans every single year. And we just seem to be cool with that. It's a price of doing business. But if some mentally deranged psychopath goes in, kills a couple of people in a Walmart parking lot, we immediately want to ban guns. And I just think we're not banning scalpels. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yes, totally agree.
Yeah. Jesse says, I agree. I will protect my loved ones by any means necessary. Will Province says, good morning, gents. Alan Kelly says, just joining coin number 1571 from occupied Virginia. Will Province says, yeah. He does have a point. And Alan, Dave, you don't know, Alan is a good friend. He is a retired state trooper from the Commonwealth of Virginia. So at this point, I'll take his opinion. Dave, I got another question for you, my dear friend. Given your incredible background, man, what can the average American do to make themselves harder to kill?
I thought a lot about that as you and I had discussed it, and I think, and again, I'm not an operator. I'm not a SEAL or a Green Beret or any of the outstanding tip of the spear guys. So, like every other, and I'll say the word average American who's trying to figure out how to work his job and keep body and soul together, you have to figure out a way to fit training in when you can. Having said that, I think step one on that is to take a good, clear-eyed look at your family and whoever that might be. And for me, it's my wife and children, and say, okay, statistically speaking, the response time of even the best law enforcement agency is not instantaneous. We wish it was. And if you believe that you exist in a world where it can go from 0 to the existential defense of your home and family within the span of less than a minute, I think I would ask that you might reevaluate the context you think you live in. And once you have that realization, now it becomes a matter of, and much like you and I, you make the best of what you got. I think physical fitness has been established as the cornerstone of all defensive actions going back to the Spartans, right? You have to be physically fit, whatever that means to you. For me, it means I have 600 pounds of weights and 15 kettlebells and a rower and a bike all in my garage so that I can work out no matter what. It also means, being able to reasonably use your hands. I think anybody who's been in DOD, we've all been on the mat at one time or another, right? We all try to get back to it when we can, but it might mean boxing. It might mean anything that has you moving your hands and feet in a manner that is defensive. I think, to quote something I heard Jocko Willink say once, carry a knife. It amazes me in the modern age how many men do not carry a pocket knife, which is something that, your grandfather and my grandfather used to take as a given no matter what. The oldest defensive weapon in the history of mankind is the club, I think, soon followed by the edged knife, right? And aside from that, take advantage of things like this. I mean, if you had asked me 10 years ago, or if you told me 10 years ago that I could join something on my own time that gave me access to world-class shooting expertise and then showed me how to do that, even if I wasn't on a range, dry firing, the best tactics available, you would have blown my mind. And yet here we are. The world is changing. And I think 30 minutes a week invested in figuring out even first aid, when it is needed, you'll wonder why you didn't spend 5 hours a week doing it. Over.
Yeah. No, well said, brother. Jeff Brown says, do you think individuals today are politically driven or becoming more cultist in their behavior?
I've just finished a book called The Machiavellians by James Burnham, which I highly recommend. And I recommend it. That's a great question. I will not try to answer it myself. I'll kind of quote a more intelligent human being. His point in that is that politics is not an entirely rational space. Hence why the end or maybe the beginning of politics is guys like the guys that are on this podcast. Whether you believe the Marine Corps is the beginning or the end of the political discussion kind of puts you on the spectrum. But yeah, I think it's both. I think that answer, what we view as politics is not very far off from cult activity.
Yeah, I agree. We talked about this when you were down here on the farm the other day. This idea that othering people, I think, is easy to do when you're locked inside your own little bubble or your own little cult or your own little political faction. Tony says, snuck in another one. I didn't see it. Yeah, Tony, good morning. Glad to have you on, brother. Yeah, I didn't put this as an event because I just wanted to give everybody an opportunity to see Dave. Dave is going to be working with us. Dave is a retiring lieutenant colonel with the United States Marine Corps. Dave and I served together for 2 long, hard, brutal years. It was some of the most unpleasant in my life. And in all seriousness, Dave was one of the only things that made that 2 years bearable. That's a fact. But so Dave's going to be working with the American Warrior Society doing some future ops and planning and stuff because Dave, this gentleman looking at you today, this beautiful quad having God here in front of you, is was the China plans officer for the Pacific. So anything that you can share with us unclassified regarding China, Dave? I know I kind of put you on the spot there.
All I will say, and I think we should all assume this is being recorded in real time by our friends across the ocean.
It is.
All I will say is that for those of you who remember the 80s, like Rich and I do, there was a time when we were convinced, because Patrick Swayze and the other Wolverines were telling us that they would land on our shores and meaningfully engage the U.S. in its own space. If you have any inkling about discovering what they might be doing or their orientation to us, I urge you to read a monograph. I think it's called Unrestricted Warfare, that came out about 10 years ago. The two gentlemen, I believe, were Chinese war college students at the time, both lieutenant colonels, if I recall correctly. And they outline a strategy of war that, interestingly, starts all the way at the highest end of the Romo and goes down to domestic infiltration operations resulting in instability. If you read that, you might have a different viewpoint on what you're seeing in the world today, especially the United States.
Dave, can you get access to that? Can you send me a link to that?
I will try to track that down. Yeah,
Okay.
That's open source, and I will send you a link to it.
So what I'll do, guys, if you're watching a replay, by the time it's in a replay status, I will put a link to that. And I'm also going to put a link to another thing you got to read, The Fate of Nations by Sir John Glubb. Dave and I were talking about it. You definitely got to read that. John says strength and fitness can overcome a multitude of other deficiencies. That's very true, man. I tell you, there's having stronger than you Fu as your martial arts is not a bad plan. But I have never been the power lifter that Dave is, so I have to rely on not only the good looks that I bring to the table, the eye candy that is Rich Brown, but also a little bit of technique. James Knowlton, my brother, another Marine, is on. Says, "Good morning, gentlemen. Stay safe out there." Of course, James is a police officer out in the Southwest. Jesse said he liked the Red Dawn reference. Chad says, another Marine. Sheesh, I'm tired of having to bring crayons to the AWS Christmas party. Oh, Chad. Yeah, I hear you. Don't crash your helicopter, brother. Seriously. So, Dave, we got about 20 folks watching us live, man. I appreciate everybody that's watching today on the replay or in the Coffee with Rich YouTube channel. Gordon Botsa says, the eye candy that is Rich Brown. Yeah, I don't have to tell you. Gal says Swayze or Hemsworth when we're talking about Red Dawn.
Swayze. Yeah.
Yes, Swayze. Dr. T.C. Fuller has given us the link, so he's done your job for you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Fuller. Let me ask you this. I like your idea, because one of the things you said when making yourself harder to kill is physical fitness, man. We hammer that home. The best gadget you can buy for your gun is a gym membership for you. We've said that time and time again, because you can't shoot a heart attack in the face. And, the older we get, the more it's going to take, the longer the recovery is going to take. So listen to Dave and make sure you're taking care of your physical fitness probably first. I love that approach when it comes to making your family harder to kill. Another thing is getting each other in as healthy a state as possible. That doesn't mean bench pressing a truck. It may just mean getting off your medication, getting off your rear end, running a 5K, whatever. Start small and go from there. But well said, brother. One of the things sometimes we ask here on Coffee with Rich is, what's your best day, worst day, Dave? Can you share that with us?
Like every chicken shit married man, I think my best day would have to be when I met my wife. And that investment has never gone down in 21 years. And she's not listening, so I'm not that bad. But my worst day would have to be watching my son go into a coma when he became a type 1 diabetic. And as we talk about, it's an interesting point you make about health. And I've heard this discussed in homeland circles, the idea that, nobody ever talks about what happens when the supply chain goes down, which will occur before everything else does. And you think about how much of our population is currently on psychotropic drugs designed to stabilize personalities, mindsets, And when that supply ends, or as in my son's case, when the Humalog stops, how far away is that, and how far to instability do we then have to travel? Because I think if you've been on Zoloft or whatever for 10 years, the you that comes out of that without Zoloft is going to be a very different you indeed.
Man, that is so well put. That is something I hadn't really considered, that with the supply chain disruptions. I'll tell you, one of them, a friend of mine will send me these high level. I don't know. I think you can pay to gain access to high level thinkers, and as they look into their crystal ball. And one of the things they were talking about with supply chain disruption is paint. And I've hired a painting contractor to do some painting here at the farm, and I'm having a hard time getting paint. What happens when we're having a hard time, as in we can't get it? Prescription drugs, whether it's the SSRI that some obscene percentage of Americans need to function, or something as basic as insulin. And what are you, as a loving parent, willing to do to make sure that your child gets the medication he needs? I'll tell you what I'm willing to do. It's
Yes.
a lot. It's a lot. And so I'll just let it just marinate in that right there, folks, because right now we have outsourced the production of a lot of our pharmaceuticals. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% come from China and India. And if that doesn't give you pause and show you what a strategic blunder that has been, then I don't know what will. Because a lot of Americans right now are aging. It's not just me at 52. It's my parents. It's your parents, Dave. It's folks that are watching, your parents. What are you willing and able and capable of doing to prevent them? And I'll tell you, there was a friend of mine who was a Marine security guard. And when the country they were in was overrun and they couldn't get food supplied, the ambassador gave the Marines carte blanche to go out at night in civilian attire and rob convenience stores to feed the embassy. So don't think it can't happen. Don't think it hasn't happened. It will happen. Johnny says, read 1 second after. It's a great read on supplies not being available. Yeah, Mike Seeklander is always talking about that book, Johnny. I'm going to write that down and do that 1 second after. I'm on it. Dave, what are your thoughts concerning, and I'm going to give you a big swath of land here, brother, and if you want to talk specifically to the following three things, I want to ask you about, as far as looking into the Lieutenant Colonel Dave Brothers, former planning officer, crystal ball, regarding the new administration, regarding the pandemic, and the economy, or some mishmash of those three. What are your thoughts on that as we move forward?
I was writing those down. Pardon me. That's why I was looking away. That is a giant swath of ground.
Take it one piece at a time if you want to.
As we talk about the defensive mindset, and I think that's what we are. I think the difference between, and this is a 20-year logistician talking. I think the difference between amateurs and professionals is that professionals start with logistics, and I think that is a poorly understood word. Because I think it tends to be one of those metaphysical words that people hear what they want to hear when somebody says it. When an infantryman hears you say that, they think about whatever they happen to not have at the second that they're thinking about it. I think in any discussion of the defense of a household, not just an individual, but a household, it has to start with the supply chain. And as we talk about risk in the modern age, and there's a great thinker on this at MIT whose name is completely blanking me right now. All of the issues that you just ran out, from the new administration to the pandemic, and I'll say this because I happened to do an interview with a former Marine who happened to be running Homeland Security during the pandemic, and he explained to me the steps he took with unfettered executive power to deal with that supply chain issue, whether it be the masks or the respirators or whatever. All of the things you just discussed center on the supply chain. They center on the ability to travel to and from somewhere, or the ability to obtain a good or service that is a necessity, not a desire. And I will say that the difference between necessities and desires is very poorly understood in the modern United States. I don't view the current administration as being, well, I don't want to go into politics too much because I know that's a fraught subject online.
Yes,
and,
it is.
Other than to say, again, I recommend James Burnham's The Machiavellians because it's not about the differences between this administration and the previous ones. It's about what has remained the same. And anytime to me that a political decision exists, and this is kind of juxtaposes the administration with the pandemic, any system or event that drives executive control from more human beings to fewer human beings, which we would call centralization, is the key decision. And whatever your governance system is, it can be judged by how much executive power or how many decisions of what magnitude exist in the hands of how many people. And the more asymmetric that ratio becomes relative to the bulk of decisions existing with a minority of people, it cannot remain stable. And there's a lot of history. I think a lot smarter guys than me on this, listening to this show. Yeah, monarchies tend to be the most stable over time. Having said that, transitioning from something like an advanced democratic republic to a monarchy will never be a stable action. And I think as we deal with more and more threats that increasingly engage a much more complex supply chain, more pressure is going to be brought to bear on our governance system to consolidate decisions to fewer and fewer hands that are enabled with more powerful C4ISR platforms or IT platforms. And a guy, many of you are probably familiar with this, but I encourage you to read Jeremy Bentham's view of the panopticon to kind of get a sense of what I've heard called the turnkey authoritarian system. Because this system could very easily be rejiggered right onto domestic America, more so than it is now, for a very near panoptic omniscience of our governing bodies into our lives, if that makes sense.
So are you, just to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding this, are you concerned with when it comes to not just the new administration, but perhaps any administration, an over-reliance on the executive power? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I think we've seen an over-reliance on executive power in many of the previous administrations, which that might be the way our government's designed. Better minds than I would have to tell you that. I am concerned in so much as, and let's take DOD, for example. If you read Tommy Frank's biography, right, there's a chapter in it where he discusses sitting in a small container with two other people, personally supervising the delivery of a Hellfire onto a convoy. And that was what, Rich? That's 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I remember reading that. Yeah, when I think we were in Louisville together. And I remember, that's funny you say that, because I remember that as being something that just blew my mind, because the fact that Tommy Franks wanted to have his own ISR platform with missiles, and then he had like a female colonel JAG officer, attorney, that would, can I shoot it? Can I shoot it? And I'm like, what are we doing here? Why do you need that? And he was just like, he was losing focus of command as so much that he wanted to shoot the freaking missile and wanted the female lawyer to tell him he wouldn't get in trouble for it. It was the most, I don't even know how to describe that, Dave. Just, oof.
In my very layman's experience, that has not grown better in the last 15 years. And the application of what I'll call the 10,000 mile screwdriver has gone from the general staff into the more civilianized, staff at OSD. And I guess what I'm saying is that the leadership that we put in place, whether it's elected or more likely the bureaucratic leadership that is in the Beltway, is increasingly gaining the ability to go to any level of your individual affairs that it chooses to. And, if we look at the last couple of years, the way in which executive authorities have been applied, how far away are we from the ability for executive authorities to order military strikes on domestic soil, which is basically makes him the judge, jury, and executioner. Again, better minds than me would have to say that, but once we established that our emails were being read and all the other things that come along with that, it's not a really far step to say that we get the wrong leader, whoever you say that is, or whoever anyone says that is, one who senses the absolute amount of power that we have invested in the federal government to conduct what you and I would call stability operations if required.
Yeah, that's always, we've talked about this before, that democracy is just the tyranny of the majority. You get 51% and they can just run roughshod over the other 49. And I don't think that's the way the founders wanted our constitutional republic to be. So I worry about that. And then every time we lose some freedoms, whether that's the Patriot Act, well-intentioned although it may be, anytime we lose freedoms, we're certainly not going to get them back. And I think back to the time when you and I were in Louisville on recruiting duty together and sitting on I can't remember the name of the coordinating council or whatever it was. And the Military Issues Processing Command was constantly trying to take our freedoms away on recruiting duty. And all they needed was the vote of every member sitting. And I'm like, I will never vote for you to take away a single freedom ever. You can feed me fried chicken at every one of these meetings and I'll smile and eat your food, but you'll never, ever get me to let a freedom go. And that's the way we should view any freedom here in America. Gordon Bodson says, look at what happened when the supply chain was disrupted with COVID. And Dr. Fuller says, de Tocqueville warned us about the tyranny of the majority almost 200 years ago. Yes, sir, he certainly did. And I don't think we've listened to it, because guess what? That leads right at. So we talked a little bit about some of the challenges with the administration, any administration. But let's talk about the pandemic. And I think that dovetails nicely into what Dr. Fuller is saying. How do you think this pandemic's been going, and where do you see it going in the future?
From my myopic little garden, I would say I was aboard Camp Pendleton, and I was engaged as the executive officer for a unit that basically we took individuals and mobilized them to high need commands. So it wasn't necessarily sending a battalion forward. It would be sending 4 master sergeants and 5 colonels and whomever to a general staff in CENTCOM or wherever you name it, or my liaison officers to Mali. That did not stop just because we were in the middle of a pandemic, whereas the news might tell you, and whatever you believe, lots of fatalities were occurring. That never stopped. And it never stopped when they came back. I guess as we move forward in the pandemic, and I'm saying this as the father of a son, at least initially, who was judged as a high-risk individual. I think the difference between my view of it is this: the difference between now and later are the leaders that we identify through the pandemic, which will be the guys who kept the trains running. And I think we really need to pay attention to what trains were kept running and what trains were not kept running, and to make allowances, because that is what is essential. If something could have stopped, it would have stopped, because the world stopped. What I realize about the Marine Corps is none of it stopped. And whether we're at war or whether we're at peace, or whatever you define this current liminal space that we happen to be in as, there are certain actions that must occur within this nation that cannot stop. And the defense of that nation through theater security cooperation, through the sheer act of training and making Marines, must never stop unless the nation itself is on fire. And even then, we should still be pouring Marines out of whatever coast is not ablaze. I think the pandemic is going to create a lot of fractures that we're not going to feel for the next 10 years along those lines.
Yeah, well said. One of the things that thinking about recruiting, there's a Marine Corps order, Papa 1100.72 Charlie, which is the military procurement manual. And the last chapter we call it the MPPM, but the last chapter in the military procurement manual is Revelations, because on recruiting duty, we always say the MPPM is the Bible. Well, just like the Bible, it has a chapter, Revelations, at the very end, which talks about when the nation is at all-out war, and how that the military entrance processing stations will work around the clock. Nobody will it will just be a factory making Marines to send to the fight. And it is a pretty chilling thing that we have, but we do have plans for that. And hopefully we will never get to the position where we have that. But the issue with the pandemic and the loss of rights is what concerns me the most. And it was a fear that I had going back to February of last year. Like right now we're dealing with fuzzy data coming out of China that we have to kind of turn a jaunt aside to. We've got our own CDC and the World Health Organization. We're grappling for a refined sense of statistical probability with what we've got here. And my concern was that as we start shutting things down and the data becomes clearer with time, the passage of time, will we loosen regulations, or we become accustomed to those regulations and never go back to the way things were? And I think we're seeing some of that now with states enacting more mask rules after they had just loosened. I just don't know how many Americans are willing to play these games that much longer. And I don't mean to be disingenuous or flippant about games, but the point of the matter is, if you're at high risk, by all means, wear a mask. If you know, I mean, you need to take care of you, and there's personal responsibility that goes along with this at the family level, at the personal individual level. But to just blanket say every American has to wear a mask, I don't know that that's the right way to go about it. What do you think, Dave?
A great book on geography came out. I'm sorry to keep throwing books that I can't remember the. I will find the link and send it to you later. But he makes the case that whether intentional or not, and I couldn't speak to that, the state versus federal system is very effective because the federal system gives the states enough leeway to act differently, which creates 50 different labs that create 50 different approaches to the same problem. And then, like any good leadership, you select the best approach and say, maybe this is the one we should support at the federal level. Whether that's occurring now or not, I'm unwilling to speak towards because I'm not informed on that. I think, however, one of the reasons, and this kind of drives down into our approach to the individual, one of the reasons we maximize liberties is not just for the comfort of the individual, but for the utility of the mass. Because if we have 5,000 different approaches to the same problem, we can harvest the top 20% and learn from that and adopt it at whatever state application we choose later on. We have, unlike many homogenous nations that don't have the level of individual liberty that we have a lab of 134 million people in the United States, and each one of them might take an individual approach. And like any good laboratory, of that 134 million different experiments, possibly we will find the one that is the actual universally applicable tool to use. And I think that maximizing personal liberty is very much in the utility of the state on that basis alone. Yeah.
And let's see, Tony says, if the country is set ablaze with civil unrest, which side will the rank and file military be on? That's a great question. I don't know, Dave, do you have an answer for that?
Tony, I think that's an awesome question. And I just from my opinion as a Marine, I don't know what side it will be on, but I have the suspicion that guys like us that are all kind of in the same space will all be on the same side, whatever side that is. You know, if it comes down to it and I'm facing civil unrest, which some of my Marines were during the riots in Los Angeles, I am on the side of the Marines that serve above, to the side, and below me. And whatever face that happens to be pointing towards is whatever face that happens to be pointing towards. And one of the strengths of this country, I really believe, is that, you know, without being too crayon eating about it, all the jarheads are going to reassert their network if there's no other network to have.
Yeah, you and I talked about that, and there are a few Marine officers that if they called and said, grab your kit, we're all meeting at this hotel, I probably would do it. And I hate to say that, but, you know, you got to be prepared. Gordon Bodson says, we've never stopped wearing masks in a healthcare setting, and Guile says the same there. And yeah, that is terrible. Let's talk about the economy, especially as a logistics officer. I'm sure this is near and dear to your heart. not just supply chain management, but the fiscal aspects as well. What are your thoughts and concerns as we move forward into 2022?
I am trying desperately to understand it. As a federal employee, I need to sensitize myself to a world full of profit and loss sheets where money is more meaningful than I think it is in DoD. Having said that, one of the ways I'm trying to educate myself is I'm reading as much about Weimar Germany as I possibly can. And one of the reasons I say that is not because, I think there's a lot of the world that thinks some sort of authoritarian party of some type is going to be given birth by the current instability, but really, how did the economics of that period interact? What carryover was there from World War I that created the economic instability that realized itself at the perfect time with a perfect human being to very, very nearly return the planet to a dark age if the wrong things had happened at the wrong time. And I'm curious now, and I've been doing a great deal of reading and listening to how things like Bitcoin interact with fiscal policy. I think Bitcoin has a lot of meaning to the way our governance system works, to the way our economy works. And better minds than I have been quoted as discussing how fiscal policy, monetary policy impacts our freedoms, especially if the government is monitoring any expenditure over, I can't remember the amount, $20,000. If $20,000 at the current IRS manning level gets attention when the IRS increases by whatever $8 billion in its budget buys, I think that threshold is going to get lower. So to answer your question in a long-winded way, I think, at least me personally, historically, Weimar Germany is what I'm reading about. And in modern parlance, Bitcoin, blockchain technology, and the ability to create currency that is outside of Westphalian nation-state dynamics is a massive and very powerful thing that we have only just begun to get our fingernails on.
Yeah, and my concern is that this decentralized finance that is cryptocurrency is something that I don't know how long our government's going to allow it to go before it becomes a real threat to our own currency. And speaking of that, the actions of this administration, I'm looking right now at the budget projections for 2021 was a $6.8 trillion outlay. And the federal government says, that's okay, we're going to take in $3.8 trillion. But of course, that leaves a simple math, a $3 trillion deficit to pile on top of the $23 trillion we already owe. And I say that to say, I don't think that people understand what a trillion is. It's 1,000 billion. We've said this before. You will reach your billionth second on this planet before you hit your 32nd birthday. You won't reach your trillionth second alive until you are 32,000 years old. And if we're going to pay back a $23 trillion deficit at $1 a second, day in and day out, we won't pay it off for almost 1 million years. Guys, the threat to our nation, especially the fact that you're reading about Weimar Germany, I think we all should probably be doing that. Because so is Dr. Michael Burry. And of course, Dr. Burry is the one in Michael Lewis's amazing book, The Big Short, who saw the housing crash coming and decided to short the U.S. housing market, something that had never been done before because it was a simple math problem that Dr. Burry had solved. It was going to crash. It had to crash. Well, guess what Dr. Burry is now saying? We're on a collision course for hyperinflation.
Yes.
So, how do you prepare for that? Well, good luck with that. We can look at, we have several historical examples, but I think there's an idea in America, Dave, that it can't happen here. There's something about the soil, the geography, what's in the water, the people that just will not allow it to happen here. And I think that's incredibly short-sighted. What do you think?
I think, and I try not to think of it whether it will happen here. I think we're at the professional level where we kind of assess it. How likely is it to happen? And you and I were talking about this yesterday. We were talking about Nicholas Nassim Taleb's The Black Swan.
Yes.
And if you read his entire body of work, which is called the Inserto, you will see, we'll take away one of his key points, which he calls the compression of complexity and its resulting increase in volatility through fat tail dynamics, which don't ask me what that means, but all it means is we're going into a place called Extremistan, where that's what he calls it. In Extremistan, things that you never thought would be possible will now become a daily occurrence. And if you look at that in the context of just say, look how cars have developed over the last 20 years. In the modern automobile, the gas pedal is not meaningfully different other than aesthetically from the enter key on your laptop. You push down on it, a processor tells another processor how much fuel to inject, and everything moves forward. When you and I first started driving, a manual stick shift created 0 lines of code between the depression of a foot and the increase of fuel to the tank. In the modern world, I think, from what I recall reading, 5,000 to 10,000 lines of code exist between the simple act of pushing down on a gas pedal and fuel going into the tank at the appropriate rate to increase your speed. And that is everywhere. And everywhere that we see, it used to be, I think, 14 mistakes. You could calculate an average of 14 mistakes to your average plane crash, trace it back. I think those 14 mistakes are going to start occurring more and more rapidly. And we're going to start seeing situations occur in failure cascades that we can't imagine. One great book and great speaker to reference on that is Max Brooks. And, it's funny. The book is World War Z, which I am not referencing the movie because Brad Pitt will not save us when the time comes. But the book is excellent work of fiction. And I have often used it to teach my junior officers how complex logistics becomes under adversity, and even at the best of times. And Mr. Brooks himself, in researching for that book, he did a lecture at the Naval War College several years ago that is definitely worth Googling, just because failure cascades cannot be controlled once they begin. Not with the supply chain dynamics, the monetary dynamics, the intellectual property dynamics, the IT infrastructure in which we exist. It's going to take one domino, and then it will be a wicked problem from which we cannot extricate ourselves without losing a lot of skin.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your point, right now, it's hard to find a Ford F-150 because they need the chips from China or wherever they're coming from, or Vietnam or Malaysia. We talked about the paint being a problem. We talked about pharmaceuticals being a problem. This Thomas Friedman sort of the world is flat, hot and crowded idea has a lot of flaws. When you talk about supply chains, and the fact that you would have a president being one of the first acts that he does is to shut down a critical pipeline infrastructure in a country that's already struggling, just baffles my mind. That's like, I don't understand whose side are you on, pal, when you're doing something like that, because what happened next, you shut down one pipeline and then you have a cyber attack, ransomware attack on the other key pipeline. And your point also about lines of code, I don't know if you know this, Dave, obviously, my son is a cybersecurity researcher for the U.S. government. But one of the papers that he authored was on making vehicles where they can't be hacked by some foreign state or whatever. And he lectured at MIT on his paper, because this is obviously a real problem that cyber has the ability to correct. After he lectured at MIT, he was a Chinese national reached out to him, wanting to know if he would share his lines of code. I can't make this up. And I told my son to call his national laboratory. And of course, the FBI was knocking on our door within about the next day. So yes, they're not our friend. China is not our friend. I'll go on record of saying that. And if they can figure out how to hack the car, wouldn't it be wild? You don't need to do an EMP. If you could just hack every American car by, tearing up the code, that would be pretty amazing. Mr. Brown says, what is the potential repercussion for military members who refuse the vaccine by the September deadline? Are you aware of that?
I am. I've stepped away from that for a minute. I don't know that I'll comment upon it other than to say I never thought I would see. I never thought I would see a military in which something like a pandemic vaccine would be a choice, regardless of how you feel about the vaccine. I am not used to having a lot of personal choices as part of the United States Marine Corps. So I don't. I have thought a lot about that particular situation. And if you go back, I mean, Rich, you remember the anthrax vaccine issues that were going in the early 2000s, some of which were valid. I mean, the VA recently put out a new program purely focused on exposure to foreign and dangerous chemicals. I can't remember what the acronym for it is, but I do not know. I know that I have heard a lot of thought, especially at the War College, on use of biological warfare and how in the 21st century that has gone from being this wild zombie apocalypse thing to, well, I can tailor a warhead to fit the 20 guys who are necessary to float that, expeditionary warfare strike group out of the pier and to X, Y, and Z for 5 days or whatever you say. So in answer to your question, I think fallout's coming. I think that choice is going to rapidly be pulled away because my understanding is that DOD is hovering around 50%, although I'm hesitant I'm not speaking for DOD on that. But that is an interesting, I can't quite wrap my mind around how we're letting Marines choose whether to be vaccinated or not.
Yeah, I don't know that I had any personal choice in 23 years as a Marine. I mean, when I don't know. I mean, I certainly didn't have any choices as what vaccines. I didn't even know what they were shooting into my arm half the time or what pill I was taking wherever I was at. So it's going to be an interesting time for sure. Dr. Fuller says how the military would react to domestic deployment on stabilizing operations is likely going to depend on how the problem is presented to them. Tell them the rioters are Chinese sleeper terrorists, one reaction. Tell them that they are American patriots fed up with the way that the government is currently being run. My guess is you get a different reaction. Marketing matters a whole bunch. And Tony says, Dr. Fuller agreed. Alan Kelly says printing money where there aren't any. Yeah, no kidding. Tony says, how do we put the train on a different track? Yeah, great question. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think to address the way I understand Dr. Fuller's statement on that is that razor's edge. And, I kind of intuit that maybe he's talking about how that's presented is more important than the actual circumstances. But I think there's a lot of thought. I've heard various news agencies treat this subject as though there's not an enormous body of work about military operations conducted on domestic soil going all the way back to, Waco was an amazing lesson in how Title 32 and Title 10 forces can interact with the Department of Justice. Baltimore, the deployment of the National Guard there, the Los Angeles riots of the 90s. There is a great case that is worth reading called Ex parte Merriman, which went back to the way Lincoln approached a Confederate recruiter that was in Baltimore at the outset of the Civil War and how he dealt with that recruiter who could very easily have recruited enough to his unit to surround Washington, so he chose, and why Lincoln chose to suspend habeas corpus in the case of Merriman, which is carried forward through the way we look at, I think it was Anwar al-Awlaki, first U.S. citizen that we used the drone strike against in OIF. It is a tough call. If you read Ex parte Merriman, you kind of have to ask yourself, well, will there be instances in which it is necessary to conduct unconstitutional actions in order to preserve constitutional functions? And I think in the modern age, that's a hard problem to grapple with.
Yeah, the drone killing of an American citizen, I thought was a watershed moment personally. Am I glad he's dead? Absolutely. No problem with that. However, at what point is it going to be okay to kill Dave Brothers or Rich Brown with a drone strike. I just think it was a bigger problem than most Americans just, went back to their Starbucks and didn't give a shit. But I thought it was an incredibly important moment that we just kind of glossed over. Yeah. Let's see. Dr. Fuller says everyone who was ordered into a line for anti-nerve agent experimental injections in the Gulf War, raise your hand. Yep. It's always, I found it, we took nerve agent pills. We took biological pills to try to give us a little bit of exposure to it before it really hit us. And I'm like, okay. I really don't, I took the vaccine. I'm not telling anybody they need to take the vaccine. You got to make a decision about it yourself. But I'm like, man, I've been vaccinated against everything. My shot record literally folds out like this. And that's what Jeff Brown says. When I went to international training, I had about 30 shots for everything global. I had no idea what I was getting, but because it was my job. Gordon says, even in the Air Force, when my father was deployed to Turkey, the whole family was vaccinated against a whole host of things without any choice. Alan Kelly says the state of Virginia is mandating the COVID vaccine. If you don't take it, you'll have to be tested weekly. Already grumbling starts. Yeah. Here in my family, someone said, hey, Dad, I laminated your vaccine card. I'm like, what do you mean to do with it? Well, you can carry it with you in case somebody wants to see it. I'm like, you know what? A year and a half ago or 2 years ago, it was like, Trump's a Nazi. And now it's like, shut up and carry your laminated card and show your papers everywhere you go. And I think we went there really quick. I just don't understand it.
Well, as somebody who had their data stolen, which I think yours was too, during the OPM incursion, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? Mm-hmm. So someone has all of your data, whether it's the United States government, I don't know, but someone already has your entire ID history.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Fuller has provided us with a link to Ex parte Merriman. I tell you what, man, you're awesome, Dr. Fuller. I need to get you back on the show. Jeff says, however, it's not a McDonald's employee's business if I did. Yeah. Dave, any other thing? I know we talked a little bit about, some crystal ball stuff. Anything that keeps you up nights, brother? What are you concerned with as you move from being a Marine Corps officer into the civilian sector? What do you see the future of our country, your own personal concerns? What do you think?
I think like anyone, and like probably every single guy listening to this right now, it is the transition from a culture that values not just a warrior ethos, but a pathos and a logos too. You think like a warrior, you are accredited like a warrior, and you have feelings for the warriors that are with you, right, left, up, and down. Going to the more, without being pejorative, going to the more mercenary world of the private sector, I think worries anybody. And I will say that my approach to it, from a guy, some will say he's a crackpot, and I think he has some crazy thoughts, but William S. Lind, who wrote everything from Fourth Generation Warfare to some other books, he says, well, if you're spending a lot of time thinking about the current extremities and emergencies of the modern era, you should probably spend more time reading the classics, because you're not thinking clearly enough about the bigger picture. And to me, I'm going to come at it by going back to books like Plato, Aristotle, Hume. You regardless of what you decide that body of work is, I think reading old books is absolutely the answer to dealing with modern problems.
Why do you say that?
Well, and even a book that all of us can somewhat understand, which is the Bible. The Bible offers a puncturing mechanism for every single half-assed equivocation or act of mental weakness that can be performed by modern man, in my opinion. And I think, regardless of your theology or whether or not you approach God as someone that you have a relationship with or not, I think it is very difficult to read the Bible in a meaningful fashion and not understand where your values lie in the modern age. Because ultimately decisions like getting vaccinated or buying a weapon or supporting an abortion or whatever happens, those are the cosmetic results of a chain of logic and value and a chain of logic and value that should extend way, way back. Those are the end of a chain that should be well developed before that point. And as you approach uncertainty, which we all do, old books that force us to think are way better than new books that tell us what we should think. And let me say that in a different way. I had a debate at the War College once about the existence of officers, and all of you will be familiar with someone in your field who believes that if you just write the perfect policy or order, we can suspend leadership and management of all kinds because it will be followed. Anyone with any inkling of real world experience understands that you need an officer corps or a leadership corps or a cadre of people who have good judgment for no other case than policy never comes within the same universe as execution, no matter how good the policy is. And there will always be instances when the only thing that can solve a certain situation is the good judgment of the individual on site to deal with it. So I guess as we look at all the uncertainty from supply chain to religious to medical to governance, I think the only way to come at it is to develop the judgment you have within yourself, which requires you to fully and completely decide what your chain of value is and how much you're willing to spend to back those values.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Jeff says, Rich Brown is a book nerd or a book junkie. I'm sorry. He is so happy for these comments. Yeah, Dave and I were incredibly well read. We had library cards when we were there in Louisville and took good use of them. Yeah. So, Dave, thanks for being on the show today, my brother.
My pleasure.
Any final comments?
None at all. And you've been very nice to me because you're a very nice human being. But for the sake of your listeners, I'd like to be intellectually honest. I am Rich's intern, and I will be operating as Rich's intern over the next several months through a program called SkillBridge. And I'm very excited about it because much like when I was a first lieutenant working with Chief Warrant Officer Brown in the past, I will be working for Chief Warrant Officer Brown, much like I was in 2005. I am super excited to be here. And one of the things that drew me to AWS for my internship instead of somewhere like Cisco or Amazon was the values that I think the guys who operate with this product have, for lack of a better word. I don't think I'm talking to a room full of strangers who don't understand me when I talk to this group.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's one of the things, you mentioned a little while ago, this idea that you're moving from a community, i.e. the Marine Corps, where, warriors are that's what we want. That's what you're bred for. That's our ethos, our pathos, our logos, to quote you. And that's why on the back of our membership coin, it actually says Warriors Wanted. And I want people to know that's exactly where this is a community for you. You're not, nobody's going to call you toxically masculine by being a warrior here in the American Warrior Society. To see, Michael Gentili says, outstanding, informative. TC Fuller says, good show, gents. Thank you. Tony says, Semper Fi, gentlemen. Michael Gentili, hey, Michael, says, outstanding and informative. Let's see, Jeff says, David, thank you for your service then and now. Chad says, Rich's head isn't going to fit through the window now. Gerald says, we'll rewind and catch the show. Alan Kelly says, great show. Welcome aboard, Dave. So guys, thanks for being on the show with Dave and I today. I'm looking forward to working with Dave closely, just like we did back in the day, and having Dave working with us and doing future ops is going to be an amazing thing. So remember, folks, the fight is coming. Be ready.
Hoorah.